everyone, this is Emma. Session 11 is about sampling strategies in research. So in this video, I'm going to talk about sampling approaches that are used in qualitative methods. First, I'll talk about some general features and types of strategies in qualitative sampling, and then we'll look at some specific sampling approaches. At the end, I'll talk about validity in qualitative research, which is tied to some of the principles of quality that we've been talking about, and which is also influenced by sampling design. So developing a sampling strategy is a really important part of study design. Sampling affects, the usefulness of the data that we collect, the type of analysis that we can conduct, the depth of inferences and interpretations that we can make, and the level of transferability, or generalizability of the study findings. So qualitative samples are usually small, and this allows for in-depth investigation of a phenomenon. Qualitative sampling also uses non-probability methods. So what does that mean? That's where people or cases are chosen based on particular characteristics. Unlike in quantitative samples, where participants are chosen at random and each participant has a known probability of being selected. So the purpose of probability sampling in quantitative methods is to create samples that are statistically representative of the broader population that the sample comes from. Which, remember, that's not the goal in qualitative research. So if we used purely random sampling in qualitative research, we could end up with a biased sample where key demographics or key characteristics are not represented. Another key feature of qualitative sampling is that it aims to reach saturation. We talked about this a little bit in session 6. This is the point at which no new data emerge, where you don't come across any new themes that might be of use to you for your research question. Qualitative sampling relies on the selection of key individual characteristics that are expected or known to be relevant to the topic that you're studying. There are sometimes many criteria, and researchers need to prioritize the ones that are most important to their research question. Qualitative sampling also involves consideration of the setting, based on its relevance for the research question, but also to help the researcher describe the context of the study. And sometimes we use these characteristics to stratify our sample. This allows us to select groups that display variation in terms of the factors that we think, are important for whatever we're studying, but we can construct groups that are fairly homogeneous within themselves so that we can compare across groups and explore, interactions between the factors. So an example would be if we were studying the experiences of low-income women accessing prenatal care. The primary selection criterion would be low-income women, right? And then beyond that, we might stratify by age group, maybe 18 to 24, 25 to 35, and 35 and above. And we might also stratify by citizenship status because we think that, experiences are likely to differ along those lines. So there are three broad strategies for qualitative sampling. Purposeful, it's also called purposive sampling. That's sampling that's based on specific criteria. Usually these include demographic characteristics, so gender and age is almost always, those are almost always criteria. And they often include also experiences or roles or behaviors. So for example, you could, design a sample based on smoking status. That's a behavior, right? Or maybe we want to study nurses, so we're sampling based on occupation. So aims of purposive sampling are to make sure that all of the groups that matter to our research question are included in our study. We also aim to have enough diversity so that we can study the impact of each of the characteristics that we've used to create the sample. So decisions about selection criteria with purposive sampling are made at the start of the study. If after you finish your data collection you realize that you need additional samples, you can add those. Theoretical sampling is where the researcher samples individuals or cases on the basis of how those people or cases might contribute to the development or the testing of a theory. So this is a really iterative process, and it generally takes longer than purposive sampling. Finally, convenience sampling is where people are sampled on the basis of their availability. Opportunistic sampling is really similar. It's when you take advantage of an opportunity to collect data as it arises. So maybe, an example is selecting people who have attended a health fair on a given day. Convenience sampling generates really limited conclusions because you almost definitely have not included, all of the relevant people or all of the relevant cases in your sample. But it can be a useful strategy in the early stages of data collection, or maybe in a pilot study, maybe to help you test your data collection method before using a more robust strategy like purposeful or theoretical sampling. So decisions around which type of sampling you use, whether it's purposeful, theoretical, or convenience if necessary, those decisions should be driven by the purpose of the research and also by the nature of the study population. So theoretical sampling is particularly useful for exploratory studies where we don't know very much about a topic, but purposeful sampling is more useful for, really in-depth investigations of some topic or phenomenon that we already know something about. We already know a little bit about it. So here's a list of common sampling approaches, and all of these fall under purposive sampling. We're going to look more closely at these in the next slides. In criterion sampling, everyone must meet some criterion. So for example, selecting people who lost Medicaid coverage. Heterogeneous samples, the goal here is to aim for maximum variation across cases or across participants so that we can highlight the uniqueness of each case and also so that we can identify any shared patterns across the different cases. So for example, sampling staff from mental health programs in both urban and rural areas and in different parts of the country so that we get the full sort of range of experience. Homogeneous sampling is the opposite. So it's where we select people or cases who have the same characteristics. We would do this to be able to give a detailed picture of something. And this type of sampling facilitates focus groups or any type of group interviewing. So for example, selecting only Black men who have sex with men in our sample is an example of homogeneous sampling. In critical case sampling, we first apply some criterion, some initial selection criterion, and then we select particularly important cases that will be critical to understanding the issue that we're studying. So for example, if funders are worried about implementing an intervention in a specific site, they might choose that site to do some form of qualitative research. Typical case sampling highlights what is normal or what's average. For example, selecting typical clients of a program or selecting refugees from the countries that are most represented. In extreme or deviant case sampling, we select very unusual or really special cases that could be enlightening. So for example, selecting the clinics with the best and the worst health outcomes. So here are three more approaches in purposeful sampling. With confirming or disconfirming case, the aim is to elaborate on some prior findings, to go further than a survey, or to explore, exceptions or to search for something unexpected. So an example would be, if you find that a program worked in 9 out of 10 schools, a question might be, well, what happened with that one school, where it didn't work? Random purposeful sampling entails selecting a small purposeful and random sample before some outcome is known. So an example would be selecting every 3rd client in a clinic or every 6th client in a clinic. So this is fairly common, and the aim of this approach is to increase credibility. Snowball or chain sampling is when, after some initial sampling strategy is applied, you identify participants from a source. So usually that's a well-connected, well-situated individual who recommends their friends or their relatives or their neighbors or just people that they know. And this can be a really useful strategy for hard-to-reach populations. So the actual size of a sample, meaning the number of participants or the number of cases in your sample, depends on several factors. One factor is the heterogeneity of your study population. If your study population is very different, that will increase the sample size. If, on the other hand, it's relatively homogeneous, you will reach saturation with a smaller sample. It also depends on the number and the nature of topics. So the more topics you have and the more complex the topics are, the larger the sample size you'll need to reach saturation, right? To make sure that you cover each topic with enough depth. The sample size also depends on the type of data collection methods. So generally, a smaller sample is required for in-depth interviews compared to focus groups. And it also depends on your budget, of course, and the resources that you have available to you. Because, each case or each participant requires resources for data collection and for analysis. So if there were fewer resources available, that might constrain the sample size. So this is an important logistical consideration, but it shouldn't drive your sample design, right? It is important to make really sort of strong and justified decisions around your sample design, even if you have few resources available. Now, all of this said, the depth and the validity of findings that you get from qualitative research has really more to do with the richness of the information you get from the participants or the cases that you've selected. And it has less to do with the specific sample size. You could have a really large sample, but if the information isn't very rich, right, if maybe the quality of the interviews isn't very high, then it's not that helpful that you had more people. Compared to a smaller sample where, the quality of the information is really rich, that's more useful.